So then we all start talking about what we do for a living. And they say, well, what do you do? And I say, I'm a professor of ethics. I teach ethics. And they're like, oh, ethics, that's interesting. Expand on that. And I said, well, it's, discussions of right versus wrong, good versus bad. I said, essentially, I spend my time teaching students to think about what it means to be a good person and what it means to act in good ways. And they said, oh, that's really interesting. What made you want to teach that? And I said, well, you know that old saying, those who can't do, teach. They didn't talk to me for the rest of the night. Hi, and welcome to this week's video lecture, An Introduction to Ethics. In this video, we're going to focus on the central concepts of ethics. On the one hand, when we talk about ethics, it might seem like we're talking about something fairly easy. Don't kill someone. It seems quite straightforward, and very few people would argue with that, until you actually start to think about it. I mean, not killing someone sounds great, but of course we might think it's acceptable to kill people in certain circumstances, for example in self-defense. So we might come up with a different category of killing that we find particularly wrong, say, murder. Of course then we have to ask what it means to murder someone. What is the definition of murder? So someone might say, well, murder is a form of unjustified killing. And of course you can see where this is going. How do we decide what is a justified versus what is an unjustified killing? So we might begin to say, we ought not to kill anybody who is innocent. And this sounds perfectly good, except it may be justified in certain circumstances. For example, imagine someone has been drugged against their will. And because they have been drugged, they start acting wildly and erratically, and they start attacking people. And at this point, they start coming for you or your loved ones. Now, at this point, you might feel justified or even obligated to defend yourself or your loved ones. But on the other hand, the person who is attacking you is innocent. He didn't choose to take the drugs, and in some sense, the drugs are forcing him to attack you. So he's not really guilty of doing anything wrong here, but it still might be justified to kill him. We can also begin to talk about whether or not it's acceptable to kill someone who is guilty when situations have been neutralized. For example, the death penalty. The person is in prison, they're no longer at this moment a threat to society, so why kill them, even though they might be guilty? We might also raise questions of war and talk about what it means to be guilty. If one country believes it is being infringed upon by another country and begins to attack them, the other country then begins to think, well, they're now guilty of infringing upon us. Both sides think the other side is guilty. Both sides think they are innocent. How do we decide these things? All of this is meant to suggest that even a simple question like, should we kill people? Should we murder people? Can become complicated once you start to actually unpack it and think about it a bit more. The first thing we can talk about with regard to ethics are the different kinds of ethics. I'm going to mention 4. One of them I'll just mention in passing, and then the other 3 we'll unpack a bit more. The first kind of ethics we'll discuss is descriptive ethics. This is pretty straightforward. In descriptive ethics, you merely look at the way a particular group or a particular individual behaves and describe it. So for example, if I say, in America, this percentage of people believes it is acceptable to drink alcohol, or to smoke marijuana, or to eat meat, or that they think war is acceptable, or the death penalty is good, or the death penalty is bad. Either way, at this point, I'm describing the ethics of a group. The second kind of ethics is meta-ethics. Meta-ethics steps back and takes a look at the bigger picture. There are a few different dimensions to meta-ethics. On the one hand, we can talk about how people define or describe ethical terms. Take a term that seems pretty straightforward, the term good. If I ask you to describe good, you'll actually find it somewhat difficult. We might say, well, that which is beneficial, but of course, bene is just a root meaning good. We might even try to get away with saying, well, the opposite of bad. Of course, it doesn't help too much to describe things by their opposites, because we could just say, well, what is bad? Someone could also say, well, good is what is good for you. But again, you can't use the word in its own definition. That doesn't quite work. The term good is complicated. How we define it, what we mean by it, this is part of meta-ethics. Another interesting aspect of meta-ethics is the question of whether or not morality is objective or subjective. The term objective here basically means morality exists and we discover it, similar to how we discover math. We don't invent math, we uncover it. Now compare a mathematical equation that someone discovers is true to, for instance, a piece of music. which someone actually composes, creates, puts together. In this sense, the music, even though the different sounds and tones already exist out there, is put together by somebody. It's created. Whereas the math, the concept exists. If the equation is true, it's always been true. We've just discovered that it's true. Similarly, for objective morality, someone discovers that something is true. For instance, murder is wrong. But that means that murder is wrong for everyone in all situations. In other words, if morality is objective, it's not a matter of opinion. It's simply a matter of fact. On the other hand, if morality is subjective, it is a matter of opinion. It's a matter of group preference, the way a group thinks or the way an individual thinks. Thinking of morality subjectively leads to what we'll call relativism. Basically the idea that all ethics or all morality is relative. Now we might ask, to whom is it relative? Does the individual create morality? Does a culture create morality? Does a tribe create morality? A family, a nation, whatever. The point is that someone, some group of people creates what is moral and what is immoral, as opposed to discovers it. And this means that morality can change over time, and it's really difficult then to say, well, whose morality is better than someone else's? One culture considers it acceptable to own slaves, one culture considers it unacceptable. If morality is completely subjective, it's difficult to know how to adjudicate between the two. On the other hand, if morality is objective, then the idea that anybody can just do whatever they want, or you have your opinion, I have mine, is not correct. In some case, we can say there are certain fundamental moral truths. There's a lot of debate about whether or not morality is objective or subjective, and of course there can be problems going either way. On the one hand, if we consider morality objective, it's always very tempting to think, well, my morality is the true morality, and then I can impose that morality on everyone else. I know this is right and this is wrong. Therefore, everybody must think this is right and this is wrong, or they are bad people. And that can get us into problems. It can get us into kind of a moral imperialism, where one group thinks they know everything that is right and imposes that upon another group. On the other hand, if we go to complete relativism, there are other problems. For example, if one group says we think it is morally acceptable to sexually abuse others, well, all of a sudden, some of us are like, well, no, wait, that can't be acceptable. There's no instance in which it's acceptable to sexually abuse. At that point, we might want to say, no, there are limits to what you can say is moral and is not moral. But there's a sense there in which we acknowledge there's an objective morality at work. My point here isn't to settle the issue, it's just to highlight the issue. But I just want you to be aware that this is a debate that occurs, and that there are good things and bad things about going in either direction. Discussing our moral terms and thinking about objective versus subjective morality is very interesting, and that's all part of meta-ethics. We can also go into what we call normative or prescriptive ethics. Normative or prescriptive ethics is different than descriptive ethics because it doesn't just describe how people act. It tries to tell people how they should act. That is, it puts forth a theory of what it means to be good or what it means to act in right ways. We are saying not just, oh, some people think it's okay to eat meat, some people think it's okay to drink alcohol, some people think it's okay to have abortions, so on and so forth. We say, no, here is the right way to think about this. And normative ethics is usually based on some kind of overarching theory in which we explore how do we know what it is to act rightly, or what it is to act wrongly, or what it is to be good or to not be good. We're going to discuss normative ethics in a bit more detail in a moment, but let me move on to the fourth kind, which we'll unpack a little bit more later as well. The fourth kind of ethics is applied ethics. Applied ethics basically takes the ideas of normative ethics or prescriptive ethics and applies them to a particular field of study. So for instance, we can talk about applied ethics in terms of environmental ethics. Not just how do we act or think in good ways, but specifically with regard to the environment. How do we act in good ways? What does it mean to be a good person? We can also talk about it in terms of the medical field, bioethics or medical ethics. That is to say, we can ask, in this particular field, how ought I apply these theories of what it means to be good or what it means to act in good ways to these particular circumstances? So we can begin to discuss things like, how do we allocate organs, especially when they're scarce? How do we deal with people who are in persistent vegetative states, or people who are brain dead? How do we deal with issues at the beginning of life, including abortion? What is the best form of healthcare, and how do we deliver that healthcare to people? How do we ration supplies when supplies are scarce? And so on and so forth. We can also talk about applied ethics in other fields like psychology. For example, in therapy, when, if ever, is it acceptable to lie to a patient? Or when is it acceptable to break confidence with a patient? These are all different forms of applied ethics. We're going to unpack these a bit more at the end of the video, focusing in particular on medical ethics. Let me return to prescriptive ethics for a moment. Historically, there are three dominant types of prescriptive ethics: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. Let's take a look at each individually. Now, if you think about human action, every human action has three basic dimensions in it. There is the agent who acts, there is the act itself that occurs, and then there is the outcome of the act, or the consequence of the act. The three theories we're going to discuss each focus on one of these aspects of human action. Deontology focuses on the act itself. Consequentialism, as you might guess, focuses on the outcome or the consequence, and virtue theory focuses on the person or the agent who acts. Can we just take a moment to recognize that there is, in fact, a T-Rex in outer space on my sweater? I just think it's odd that none of you have mentioned that yet. I think that's kind of weird. No, Carl, I don't think the sweater is based on an actual photo astronauts took in outer space. The dinosaurs are dead, man. You need to let it go, okay? Just go watch Jurassic Park and enjoy it. Deontology and consequentialism have something in common. They both ask basically, what ought I to do, or how ought I to act? One of the more interesting ways of describing the difference between deontology and consequentialism is a classic thought experiment called the trolley example. In the trolley example, you imagine yourself standing on a lever. A trolley is coming down the tracks and is barreling forward toward these 5 individuals who have been tied to the tracks. If you pull the lever, the tracks at a switch will change and the trolley will be diverted from the 5 people. You'll save their lives. Now, in this scenario, you can imagine almost anyone would say, of course, I'll pull the lever. I'm going to save 5 lives. That's a good thing. But in this particular scenario, you have to imagine also that there's someone tied up on the other track. And if you pull the lever, you will save those 5 people, but you also condemn that other person, that single person, to death. And the question is, what do you do? Now, because this is a hypothetical situation, we can imagine that there are no other options other than pulling the lever or not pulling the lever. You can't wave the trolley down. You don't have time to run and rescue the people from the track. You just have to essentially decide, will I pull the lever or will I not? Now, I know what you're thinking about the trolley example. This is a completely ridiculous scenario and no one's ever going to find themselves in this situation. But the truth is, I knew a buddy once who found himself in just this situation. Yes, I did, Carl. Shut up. Now, you might be interested to know what he did in this situation. Well, he didn't pull the lever, but it wasn't because he had some grand philosophical reason. He really just collapsed into a ball on the ground, curled in the fetal position, and cried until it was all over. Come to think of it, I think he's still just lying in a ball crying to this day. And that is the beauty of ethical discussions. It can cause you to collapse into a heap of nothingness and just feel so desperate and confused that you just want to weep endlessly. God, I love my job. So take a moment and think about what you would do. Would you pull the lever and save the 5, but kill the 1, or not pull the lever and allow the 5 to die? If you find yourself saying, I would pull the lever and save the 5 and kill the 1 because, well, 1 death is better than 5 deaths, you're thinking very closely along the lines of consequentialism. If you find yourself saying, well, no, I don't want to pull the lever because it's better to allow 5 people to die than to actively cause the death of 1 person, that fits better with deontology. I'll explain why in a minute. Let me just tweak the scenario a little bit to see if you would keep the same answers. Imagine for a second that there's 1 trolley heading down the track, and there's 5 people on the track, and you're standing on a bridge over the track. Now you can see that the trolley is coming down, these 5 people are going to die. There's also this very large individual, let's say, I don't know, the master of the universe, He-Man. He's looking over this bridge at the track below. He wants to see what's going to happen. Now he's leaning over so far you kind of realize if you just pushed him a little bit, he would probably fall down and the trolley would hit him. And let's say for some reason you feel extremely confident that the trolley would then stop and not hit the 5 other people. Now, those of you who think you would pull the lever to save the 5, would you also push this person over the edge of the bridge? Typically, people become a little bit more squirmish here. But the question is, why? What's the difference between pushing someone over the edge and actually pulling the lever? In both cases, you're taking a particular action that's going to result in a death. And if you hadn't taken that action, that death wouldn't have happened. In essence, in both scenarios, both in pulling the lever and in pushing the person, you are killing someone to save 5 other people. People try to argue that it's not the same thing, but as far as I can tell, they're essentially the same. Which raises the question, why are people willing to pull the lever but not push the person over the edge? And the only thing that I can imagine is that people don't like to feel that they are touching the person when they kill them. They want to stay as remote as possible, and pulling a lever from far away makes that feel better. Which raises another possible scenario. You're on the bridge. There's someone looking over the bridge. There's also a wrecking ball on the bridge. And if you pull a lever, the wrecking ball will swing and knock the person off the bridge onto the tracks. Similar scenario, except you don't have to push them, you just have to pull a lever. In this scenario, people also feel a little bit squeamish. No, that's too close to killing the person. These different variations are interesting because they highlight one, in some cases we feel confident trading lives. Better to kill 1 than to allow 5 to die. But the dirtier we have to get our hands, the more hesitant we are to do that. Which suggests, I guess, what we really care about is our own moral standing, not really how many people we kill. You're right, Carl. We're just an awful, awful species. On the right side, we'll probably completely obliterate ourselves within, let's say, 200 to 300 years, so gotta look on the right side. People who feel reluctant to kill someone, who wouldn't pull the lever, wouldn't push the person, and wouldn't knock them over with the wrecking ball, tend to believe in their mind that it is wrong to kill, or as we said earlier, it is wrong to murder someone who is innocent. This is a rule. We consider it to be a duty, and we live by this. There's no scenario in which we feel it is acceptable to murder someone else. This is the heart of deontology, which is duty-based ethics. The father of deontological thinking is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was convinced that there are certain rules, what he called categorical imperatives, that apply to all people in all places, and you cannot violate these rules, no matter how much good comes out of it. So for instance, Kant might say, if you can murder an innocent person and thereby save thousands of others, or at least potentially save thousands of others, you still shouldn't do it, because it's wrong to murder an innocent person. Kant's categorical imperative came down to a few basic ideas. 1. Every action that we commit has a maxim underlying that action. What this means is that every action that we commit, there is some underlying justification, some reason we think it is acceptable to do that action. Some of you have probably cheated on an exam or a homework assignment before. Somehow you convinced yourself that it was acceptable to do that. The reasons you provided to yourself about why it was acceptable to cheat is a maxim. For instance, some people might say, this class is just way too hard and nobody can live up to these standards, so it's acceptable to cheat in those scenarios. Other people might say, I had a really busy week, a really difficult week, and I just didn't have any time to study. Basically, then the maxim would be that when you have a very difficult week, it is acceptable to cheat on an exam. That's the maxim. Someone might say, well, yeah, sure, I'm cheating on this exam, but I'm going to get my degree and do a lot of good for the world. And again here, it is acceptable to cheat on an exam when cheating on the exam helps you to do a lot of good in the world. All these are maxims underlying actions. So Kant said, when we act in certain ways, we have to identify the maxim underlying our action. The second step is, we have to ask ourselves, can we will that all people in the world would live by this same maxim in this same scenario? So imagine a situation in which you said, I cheated on an exam because I had a really busy week. Therefore, I would find it acceptable that everyone who has busy weeks can cheat on their exams. Well, most of us might be a little bit hesitant there because people have busy weeks all the time. And if so many people are cheating on their exams, there might be a lot of negative outcomes to that. For example, grade averages might get inflated, and people who are actually studying might start looking less and less or have a lower GPA than people who are cheating. The other negative consequence would be people probably wouldn't be learning the materials. I don't want to go into a doctor's office and have the doctor come in and say, man, I was really busy in college. Now I'm just thinking, this chum is going to kill me. They haven't studied. They just cheated their way through college. What we're really saying then is that the maxim that justifies our own actions in our mind, we wouldn't allow it to justify those same actions for others. This means for Kant that it is not a categorical imperative, because we can't will that everyone live by that same maxim. So in essence, one of Kant's categorical imperatives is, act in such ways that you would will everyone else would act in those same circumstances. Now, Kant has other categorical imperatives, but we're just going to focus on this one. One of Kant's more controversial ideas was that there was a categorical imperative against lying. Kant believed that it was never acceptable to lie in any circumstances. And he even wrote a passage about how if someone is hiding from a murderer in your house and the murderer comes and asks you if they're there, it is morally unacceptable to lie at that moment. Now, his reasonings are a bit complicated, but the basic idea of it is anytime you lie, you take away the value and meaning of words that we share to each other. Think about the syllabus I gave you for this class. If at the end of the semester I just told you, oh, I'm going to give you whatever grade I want, and that syllabus doesn't mean anything to me, you might find yourself, the next class you go into, saying, well, there's no reason for me to trust the syllabus anymore because professors can just throw it out whenever they want. In essence, because I violate the syllabus, I cause you to lose trust in the very kinds of contracts and communications that you have with your professors. Similarly, anytime we lie, Kant argues, we cause ourselves to lose trust in the institution of truth-telling between individuals and society. So in Kant's mind, even though we lie for what we perceive to be good intentions, for instance, saving the person from the murderer, ultimately we're doing a harm. Now, to understand this, you have to partly understand that Kant differentiates between perfect obligations and imperfect obligations. A perfect obligation is something that you have to do or not do in any circumstance. So, for example, you have a perfect obligation to truth-telling. You must tell the truth in all situations. You have a perfect obligation not to lie. Well, I suppose, in some sense, truth-telling is not a perfect obligation, in as much as you could say nothing. But if you do speak, you must tell the truth. Perfect obligations in this sense tend to be negatives. It is never acceptable, for instance, to murder. It is never acceptable to treat a person, a human person, as a means to an end or as an object. It is never acceptable to lie. Imperfect obligations are obligations that you have to take seriously, but that you can't do completely or wholly. For instance, taking care of the poor is an imperfect obligation. It's imperfect because you ought to do it, but you can't do it nonstop. If you did, you would never do anything else because there's a lot of poor people and you would have to do a lot of work to take care of them. You wouldn't be able to have a family, you wouldn't be able to go to school, you wouldn't be able to own any property. All of this because you have a perfect obligation to help the poor. For Kant, this can't be a perfect obligation. So positive things or positive actions, having compassion, being kind, helping those in need, are imperfect. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do them or that you're not obligated to do them. It just means that there are limits to your obligation. There's a limited negative responsibility. That is, you don't have to do everything you possibly could do to help others all the time, because if you were obligated like that, you would never get anything else done. So to recap deontology, which is one theory of prescriptive ethics, the basic idea is you have certain perfect duties that you must live by. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, so on and so forth. You must live by these obligations in all scenarios, regardless of the outcome. So even if you could lie to save people from being harmed, it would still be wrong. Even if you could steal to feed people who are hungry or starving, that would still be wrong. Now that might seem a little odd to you. In most cases, if I asked, would you lie to save the life of an innocent person? Many people would say, of course I would. Why not? And this leads us to our next form of prescriptive ethics, consequentialism. In deontology, an act is either right or wrong in and of itself. Because it's right or wrong in and of itself, you either are supposed to do it or you're not supposed to do it. The circumstances don't really matter. It's always wrong to lie regardless of the situation you find yourself in. In consequentialism, acts aren't intrinsically good and they're not intrinsically evil. What matters is the outcome of your acts. Now, there's many different forms of consequentialism. They all share in common the basic idea that what makes an act right or wrong is the outcome. The question is, how do we know whether or not an outcome is good? We could say, for example, well, what makes an action good is if it has an outcome that's best for me. This is called ethical egoism. We could say, what makes an action good is whether or not it has an outcome that's best for everyone else, not me. We might call this altruistic consequentialism. The most famous form of consequentialism is utilitarianism. The two names that are most associated with utilitarianism are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. In utilitarianism, the idea is you act in such a way that produces the best results for the most amount of people possible. So for instance, if a utilitarian asks the question, should I lie? The answer is not whether or not lying is intrinsically right or wrong. The answer is, well, lying in this situation, how much good and how much harm will it produce? If lying produces an overall greater aggregate of good, then you should lie. Now note here, I'm not just saying that you can lie or that you're permitted to lie. You should lie. That is, lying is the moral thing to do in this situation, which means that in some situations for utilitarianism, telling the truth could be immoral. Now, of course, it's feasible to imagine a situation in which telling the truth would produce more good than telling the lie, in which case you would be obligated to tell the truth. When we talk about utilitarianism, we can also talk about two different subcategories. On the one hand, we can talk about act utilitarianism. In act utilitarianism, you consider the outcomes of every individual act. So for instance, it's not just whether or not lying is generally good or wrong. It's in this particular situation, right now, if I lie, what will the outcome be? For some people, that's pretty exhausting. I mean, it would be annoying if your friends asked you to go to Chipotle and you said, hold on, I got to decide. Let me pull out my moral abacus and weigh all the goods and cons. In essence, you're sort of constantly having to weigh everything for every single decision. So some utilitarians have suggested a different approach, ruled utilitarianism. In ruled utilitarianism, you don't measure the outcome of every single action. Rather, you measure the outcome of basic rules by which you would live. So for an example, imagine a situation where someone doesn't have a terminal disease, but let's say they're severely depressed, or they're in a lot of physical pain, and they say, I would like to end my life. On the one hand, the act utilitarian would look at that particular situation and say, this act here, how much harm will it produce? How much good will it produce? Is the family okay with it? Are the doctors okay with it? And if this particular act has more good than harm, they'll say, well, okay, then it's the right thing to do. A rule utilitarian will say, well, wait, let's look at this not in this particular case, but as a general principle. If we decide that it is acceptable for people to take their own lives when they're not terminally ill, what's going to be the net consequence of that across society? Might there be abuses of it? People being forced to die against their will, or talked into dying against their will. These are things they would consider, and if they decided that even if this particular act, this particular situation, the good outweighs the bad, if on the grand scheme of things, the bad outweighs the good, then we shouldn't allow this to happen as a general rule. Now, deontology and consequentialism both have their benefits and their drawbacks. On the one hand, deontology touches on something that most of us think is true, that some things are just wrong. So go back to the example of sexual abuse. Hopefully, there are very few people who would say, well, sexual abuse is bad and all, but if it produces enough good, that's okay. Most of us just want to say, sexual abuse is not okay, ever. Even if you think it produces some kind of good, you still shouldn't do it. And a deontologist can say that regardless of the situation, you should not engage in this practice. On the other hand, deontology can lead to a sort of rigid moralism that doesn't allow for any bending or any consideration of the outcomes or consequences. Go back to the example of lying. Most of us would say, I would gladly lie if it saved someone's life. So on the one hand, deontology gives us a system where we can say certain things are evil, and on the other hand, it gives us a system where it can easily be warped into a moral rigidity. Consequentialism is very helpful, avoiding that moral rigidity in a sense because we don't feel bound to act this way all the time. Utilitarianism would allow us to lie in situations where lying produces more good than harm. On the other hand, utilitarianism could theoretically approve of particular actions that we might find egregious. For example, if you were in a scenario where killing one innocent individual would allow you to harvest their organs and distribute them to 5 people who are in need, providing life-saving care to those people, it's possible to reason through a utilitarian way of thinking that that is the right thing to do. Maybe even that we're morally obligated to kill that person. But most of us don't find this kind of thinking acceptable. That is, we wouldn't find it acceptable to kill one person to save the other 5. Unless, of course, they were laying on the trolley tracks. Then we would just go ahead and completely obliterate them. Deontology and consequentialism both focus on the action. That is, the fundamental question is, what should I do? What action should I commit? Virtue ethics is going to be different in that it asks a different fundamental question. What kind of person should I be? Now, actions are still extremely important. They help develop us into the kind of people that we want to be. But the emphasis is on developing good characteristics. A virtue ethicist might look at the trolley example and say, well, the question isn't how will I act in that instance? The question is, what kind of character have I developed throughout my entire life that brings me to that moment? In other words, whether or not you pull the lever is a decision you've been making your entire life based on the kind of characteristics you've developed in yourself up to that point. Now, there's an interesting relationship between virtue and actions. That is, the kind of characteristics we ought to have and the kind of actions that we commit. People who lie and continue to lie will become liars. That is, dishonesty will become not a virtue, but a vice for them. On the other hand, people who constantly tell the truth, who practice telling the truth, will become honest people. Now, most of us think in terms of virtue ethics. If I asked you to think of your best friend, and I said, describe your best friend to me, very few people would start listing actions that the best friend has committed. They would start listing virtues. Well, she's honest, she's kind, she's powerful, she's fierce. We're listing characteristics, and these characteristics we consider to be good. Now, this raises an interesting question. How do we decide which characteristics are good and which characteristics are bad? The Greek philosopher Aristotle, one of the main names associated with virtue ethics, thought that a good characteristic or a virtue was a mean, a middle way between excesses. Think of a virtue like being courageous. We know what the lack of courage is. It's cowardliness. But there's almost an excess of courage we might call foolhardiness, right? Or just stupidity. On the one hand, someone who's extremely afraid of a tiny insect might seem cowardly to us. Someone who's not willing to risk anything to help another human being appears as cowardly to us. Now, someone who's willing to take reasonable risks to save another human being begins to look courageous to us, even someone willing to risk their own lives. But someone who does something completely foolhardy or stupid, well, that begins to look problematic. Consider, for example, a small Italian plumber who decides to take on a fire-breathing dragon. There's really only one way that's going to end. So virtues for Aristotle are these in-between, these middle paths between excesses. But they're also characteristics that are fitting to our nature. For Aristotle, each creature had a nature, and that nature had a telos. A telos is just a Greek word that means the end, aim, or goal of something. If I start talking in terms of telos, good starts to make a little bit more sense. For example, if I asked you what a good bike was, you might say a good bike is a bike that is safe, gets me from point A to point B, is reliable. These are all good characteristics of a bike. But what makes these good characteristics of a bike is that we have a sense of what a good bike exists for, its purpose. So the question then is as simple as, what is the purpose of human beings? Of course, that's not a simple question, and people will differ widely on how they answer, but that gives us an image of how we might start thinking in terms of virtue ethics. We could answer from a religious standpoint and say human beings are directed toward a god or toward some great mystery. We could answer from an evolutionary standpoint and say human beings are directed toward communal survival. We're social animals, and that means that characteristics that facilitate good living in society are virtuous. There's a number of different ways we can answer the question, but the point is, thinking in terms of teleology helps us to think about what makes a characteristic good or a characteristic bad. Now, virtue ethics solves a lot of problems that consequentialism and deontology have. It doesn't lend itself to the rigidity of deontology, in as much as virtues are more about these characteristics than about very, very specific actions. Though, of course, we can also say people who have certain good characteristics will probably never act in certain ways. However, with consequentialism, it helps us to avoid the notion of saying, well, the consequence of this action are good, even though the action is terrible, therefore I should probably do it. For consequentialism, the end justifies the means. That is to say, if the end is good, however we get there is good. For virtue ethics, the end, which is to say the goal or purpose of a human life, defines the means, and the way that we get to the end is just as important as the end itself. This is a very brief introduction to different forms of prescriptive ethics. There are many different approaches and ways people have tweaked these ideas and critiqued these ideas. For example, there's a number of different feminist approaches to ethics. For example, there's a number of feminist ethics that critique some of these theories. But for now, I just want you to have a general sense of these basic three theories and allow those theories to give you the opportunity to evaluate how you think and how you act and how you decide what it means to be a good person. Let's end this video by looking at applied ethics. And I want to focus on medical ethics in this particular case. For example, we might explore the issue of euthanasia. Now, euthanasia is a very complicated topic, and there's many different kinds of euthanasia. You have passive euthanasia, where you remove life-giving care or deny life-giving care to someone. You have active euthanasia, where you introduce something that actually kills the person. You have physician-assisted dying, where you provide the person the means to take their own life. Furthermore, between active and passive euthanasia, you have a number of different kinds. For example, you can have voluntary active euthanasia, where the person requests to be given medicine that will end their life. You can have involuntary active euthanasia, where the person is administered life-ending medication against their will. Similarly, you can have voluntary and involuntary passive euthanasia. You can also have non-voluntary passive euthanasia, where the person is no longer able to give their consent or not to whether or not they die. For instance, maybe they have severe dementia or they're comatose, persistent vegetative state. In these times, having advanced directives might provide some kind of clarity on the issue. But the point is we can begin to explore this issue of applied ethics by considering some of these ideas we've looked at. Now, one of the most common approaches of applied ethics in medical ethics is called principlism. And the most common form of principlism is fourfold principlism. In this approach, we take four basic principles. First, beneficence. Second, non-maleficence. Third, respect for autonomy. And fourth, justice. We take each of these principles and try to specify them and apply them to unique scenarios. For example, beneficence says, I ought to do what I can to help another human being. This makes sense as a doctor, certainly part of the Hippocratic Oath. Non-maleficence says, I will not do anything to harm the individual. Again, very similar from the Hippocratic Oath. However, respect for autonomy takes things in a different direction from the Hippocratic Oath and stops focusing on what the doctor will or will not do and asks, what does the patient want? And justice explores issues of, well, how do we allocate resources? What's fair for people in medical practice, both for physicians and for patients? Now, obviously, these principles are going to conflict. For example, take the case of euthanasia. Someone might exercise their autonomy and say, I want to be killed because I have this terminal disease that's extremely painful. However, a doctor might hesitate to kill the person because they would consider that a harm and a violation of non-maleficence. Or the doctor might prefer to use some form of palliative care to treat the patient because that is doing good on behalf of the agent, beneficence. Or the doctor might say, actually killing the patient is in this case a mercy, and that is beneficence. Lastly, the doctor might also consider issues of justice. Is this patient under any pressure, societal pressure or otherwise, to end their life against their will? After exploring all these principles, we might come to a more reasoned explanation as why we think such and such is the right path to take. Now, in some cases, it's fairly obvious. Again, go back to the example of my son needing a shot. Beneficence seeks the well-being of my son. Non-maleficence doesn't want to harm him. But if I have to harm him to seek his ultimate well-being, well, it seems like that's a good decision to make, even if he doesn't want me to do it. However, once my son becomes an adult, there becomes a limitation to how much I can violate his self-autonomy, or any physician could violate his self-autonomy. So if I go in and see a doctor and I have cancer, and the doctor says, well, we should really give you chemotherapy, I have the right to say, no, I don't want that. Provided I am in my right mind, the doctor cannot force me to get that treatment because he or she must respect my autonomy. The idea is that these four principles begin to conflict and challenge one another, and then we have to consider how do we apply these principles to very specific cases to come up with a reasoned moral response to the situation. This is a very basic introduction to ethics. We looked at descriptive ethics, meta-ethics, prescriptive or normative ethics, and lastly, applied ethics. While this doesn't make anyone an expert in the field, hopefully it will give you some basic idea of some of the different kind of themes and ideas and concepts that are perennial in ethical discussions. We'll revisit some of these ideas throughout the rest of the semester. I hope you enjoyed this video. Now, as a reward for watching this video, watch this wonderful clip of my son learning how to do magic with a wand.
Yeah. Show me how you get it to light up. What do you say? Lumos. What are you holding?
Wand. That's the word. And D.
Are you spelling words with your wand?
That's the dog.
How do you spell it?
Like D.
Like a D.